Thank you.
So, more than 6 decades on, Nigeria, a country that by equal measure frustrates and fascinates, a country that's gone from galloping development to blistering disaster. 63 years ago this week, Nigeria achieved independence from Britain, and the period that followed has been held up as a golden era, with better security, better facilities and better social services, along with leaders who were almost entirely selfless. But by 1966, the passionate idealism of independence had been replaced by tribal animosities, and the series of coups and civil war that followed became the first sign of a failure of both military and civilian political leadership. 63 years later, the country is still mired in a leadership crisis, with a fiercely disputed presidential election yet to be resolved. In those circumstances, how can Nigeria correct its sense of misdirection and restore the squandered fruits of independence? Well, my next guest, Professor Ibrahim, is recognized in capitals across Africa and the world as one of the leading Nigerian political scientists of his generation, in addition, of course, to being chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the respected Center for Democracy and Development. And perhaps more than most, Professor Ibrahim has thrown the issues that affect this country into sharp international focus. So, as Nigeria turns 63, where does he think this country is headed, and what could that direction mean for its people? And Professor Ibrahim joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
And welcome back. I know you've been traveling a bit,
yes, indeed,
sharing your knowledge with the rest of the world. Well, let's talk about this country. How do you gauge the mood in Nigeria today, 63 years after independence?
I think Independence Day always evokes in Nigerians a sense of optimism. But at the same time, we always question that optimism and ask, what's the basis? For me, I was in primary one when independence came. So I was there for all the 63 years of celebrations that have followed each other. And for each of them, the future is seen as bright. The perspective is seen as good. But as year passes year, we don't see progression. And that is where it's always a mixture of frustration and optimism. The optimism is for survival. If I lose hope about the future of this country, I get depressed and I start questioning, well, what's life for? So you must always keep a dose of optimism. So you must always keep some belief, because without that belief, the urge to seek a way forward disappears, and then collapse will be certain. My independence message is always therefore two-pronged. First, it's important to keep hope alive. It is important to believe. And it is important for you as a citizen to always think, what can I do to make sure that next time we will start seeing progress?
Of course, the key to all of that in many ways, I mean, there has to be some way of moving people and moving the country in the right direction, and then things start to happen. Do you see any change in Nigerian politics or society that kind of parallels this hope for an urgent change of direction that you and the Nigerian people are yearning for?
I think for me, what one can see very clearly is a decline in the culture of leadership. People seek power. They get power without any clear idea of what they want to do with that power. That has been the difference between much of Africa and much of Asia, for example. Asian societies have been very corrupt as African societies. But Asian leaders didn't go in just to steal money. They stole money, but they had a culture of leadership that we want our society to progress.
And they didn't take everything.
They didn't take everything. They took what they thought they needed, and the rest they used for development. So the question for me as a political scientist is, why is it that we have fewer and fewer people in power who have a culture of leadership, a purpose of seeking power, goals they want to achieve, objectives they set for themselves, and seek, therefore, the competence to make sure those objectives could be achieved? That's where we've been getting it wrong, and that's where I think we need to rejig the whole situation of our leadership.
So it's your sense that it could all turn for the better with the right sort of leadership, the right policies, or has the country failed so deeply that, I mean, there can only be little crumbs from the table, but no real dramatic turnaround, what with just about 30 or 40 years of crude oil left, for instance?
I think a turnaround is very possible in this country. We've had many missed opportunities. I think Yar'Adua coming after Obasanjo would have made a great leap forward had God given him the health to hold on. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. Then we went in succession to two regimes that grossly underperformed. We are at the beginning of another regime. It's still shaky. We don't know what's the future for it. But it's also coming with some ideas that may work. We are yet to see evidence of that. But I think it's a bit too early to say that may not work. But in any case, I think it's important to allow issues to resolve themselves in the tribunals first.
Right. Meanwhile, of course, I mean, we're here we are 63 years later. Bandists and terrorists and criminals are holding the country hostage. And it's astonishing, isn't it, the ease with which they appear to be managing to get real leverage on the ground in this country.
Absolutely. One of the things this country did was forget that we have a very large youth bulge, that 70% of the population are youth, and that youth we are not properly providing education and jobs for. We have a very high population growth rate, one of the highest in the world. And when you produce so many children that you don't train and you don't provide jobs for, you are setting yourself along a disaster line, because they see what's going on, they understand what's going on, and what they see is that lack of culture of leadership, that it's all about self-interest. And why is it those in power could do what they want? Is because they control the guns that are in the hands of the army and the police. So they are able to read out the tea leaves. The key issue are the guns. So they start procuring the guns. And once they did that, they leveled the field. What defines a state, as we know from Max Weber, is the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence. Now, when you have states where that monopoly of the legitimate use of violence is successfully questioned in an empirical way by young people who are saying, your violence is not more legitimate than mine, and you have the guns, I have the guns, let's fight it out. then you know you have a real state crisis before you.
That's an excellent analysis. So in that context, what's the vital piece of the jigsaw that needs to fall into place for the future of this country to be more secure?
I think there are a number of key issues. Increasingly, I find myself returning to the ABC of the state. The first rule of a state is that it must be able to take money from citizens. It must be able to tax them. And when you are able to tax them, you can use those resources to provide public goods. That is the basis of the bond that creates a state. Because we've had a rentier state that has lost the skills and the capacity to tax the population for 50 years, all it depends on is rent. Now that rent disappeared because that rent was mainly from one source, petroleum, which the leadership now starts stealing and selling privately. That means that rent is no longer coming in, and you've lost the capacity to tax. What's important about the capacity to tax is the mutual obligation you create between the state and the citizen. You collect money from the citizen says, this is my money, you must use it well for the purposes of the community. So that's what's called rebuilding the mutual trust between state and citizen. And I think that's one of the key ideas we have to look at. Because once you try to tax the population in a serious way, and you don't use that money for the public good, then you create a crisis of legitimacy that's even higher than the previous crisis. And that creates, therefore, a no-go area. But I think over and above that, it's really the question of the choice of leadership. Elections have always been problematic in this country, but on the whole, I feel there has been significant improvement. And I always tell people, recall 2003, 2007 elections, everything was decided by government. That's no longer the case. There is still fraud, there is still manipulation, but in many instances, people are able to choose their leaders. In that case, the choice of who you elect becomes important. Every community knows people who are responsible, people who have a vision of the public good, and if gradually we start ensuring that such people access public office, then you are making a gradual improvement in that culture of leadership.
Fascinating. Professor, I want to thank you very much indeed. Professor Ibrahim is a leading political scientist. He's chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you very much indeed.